Welcome to everybody. My name is Bob Dandrew. I'm one of the co-founders of Partners for Climate Action. We're really thrilled with the turnout for this event. Actually, we had over 350 people sign up for this topic, which just reveals how important this topic is to people. And I know you're going to learn a lot today, and we're really glad to have you here. For those of you who don't know, Partners for Climate Action, or PCA, as we call it in shorthand, works to foster meaningful ecological and climate action within the bioregion of the Hudson Valley. And by bioregion, we mean the land surrounding the Hudson River estuary watershed. So from Albany down to the tip of Manhattan, Western Mass, into the Catskills. And we do our work in a number of ways. First of all, grant making, offering technical support to nonprofits and municipalities that are engaged in this work, program development, and educational offerings like this morning coffee event. Our work is made possible through donations, and we certainly want to encourage anybody who's able and inspired to please think about sending us a donation. You can check our website. We'll include a link at the end, climateactionhv.org. Click the donate button if you can. Now, some logistics for today. This session will be recorded, and we're going to post it both on YouTube, and you'll be able to find it on our website, so you can watch it again, share it with friends. We do want to encourage everybody, if you haven't already, please mute yourself, and also make use of the chat feature here. We're going to have time at the end for some questions and answers, and we just encourage everybody, use the chat feature to put your question down, and because we're going to have hundreds of people on this webinar, rather than repeating questions that have been asked before, if you would kind of read the questions in the chat before you put your own, see if there's one that actually matches yours or comes close enough, and use the thumbs up feature just to indicate that you support that question and you'd like that to be prioritized. If you see in the chat, you'll see where the comment appears, and then there'll be usually a little smiley face, sometimes a heart. Just click on that and you'll see a bunch of icons pop up, and thumbs up will be on there. So please do use that. We're going to prioritize those with the most likes. So our topic for today, the deer crisis, the threats facing New York State forests and biodiversity. I just want to say up front, I think this session is going to be a challenge for many of us because the issue is so challenging. You're going to hear a lot more about this from our speaker, but the fact is our forests are at risk of collapse. Nobody knows how long it would take without some intervention on our parts, but some folks say between 30 to 50 years, the forests that we have now, we're not going to see. And this is a challenge just to accept as a fact, because none of us want to think that the forests that we enjoy right now are going to disappear. But the proof of this problem is really seen right now if you just go out in the woods and you notice for most of our forests in the bioregion, there's no understory. There's many contributing factors to this. Climate change, of course, invasive species, development and overdevelopment of land, Asian jumping worms. But the main cause, we know as fact, is the overpopulation of deer. And this is deeply challenging because I think deer are so beautiful. They're innocent. We love them. And we know too that their overpopulation is not their fault. They're just being deer. This is a result of human activity. Um, and I think from Partners for Climate Action's perspective, addressing this is going to take a real paradigm shift, a change in the way we think about the forest, the way we think about our relationship to the forests and to nature, um, because we're stewards. Nature is not going to be able to solve this problem on its own. I know some of us like to think that that will happen, but this is a matter of imbalance, like serious, severe imbalance, and without human intervention. All we're going to have in place of the forests now, that we know now, is Japanese barberry and multiflora rose and basically scrub brush, because the maples and the oaks and the other woods that really distinguish our forests today are going to disappear because there's no new ones coming up. The saplings are gone. They're being eaten. So there's several interventions, and our speaker is going to share those with you. I just want to say PCA's role here is to raise the critical nature of the issue and to help educate the public. We're going to leave you to decide what you want to do about this. We don't feel that it's our job to come out strongly on one over the other. But we know this is a challenge to all sectors who have interests. Of course, animal welfare advocates, and there are many of us here, hunters who have, historical relationship to the woods and deer, New York State legislators, the state agency personnel who are responsible for monitoring and regulating our forests, home gardeners and homeowners, car drivers who I think many of us are fearful driving on the roads, knowing that the deer are just so close to the edge of the roads, and there's a lot of accidents. So none of this is easy, and maybe it's going to be impossible to arrive at consensus, but the first step really is to understand, and that's why we're here. For Partners for Climate Action, recognizing this problem, we created a task force in 2024, and its mission really was to study, share info, and nurture collaborations where possible among the various sectors. We're so fortunate to have Eli Arnow as our chair. I first met Eli. He had submitted a grant request to us, actually, for the town of Gallatin. He was chairing their Conservation Advisory Commission. And the town wanted to put up something called a deer exclosure, which frankly, I'd never heard of. But it was from spending time with Eli, visiting the exclosure, just being dazzled by his encyclopedic knowledge of the forests and his passion for nature. I could see, like, this guy has to be involved with our work. I feel like there's a destiny issue here. I'll say about Eli just a little bit. First of all, he's a land steward. He's responsible for managing a lot of land in Columbia County. He's a graduate of SUNY ESF, the Environmental Science and Forestry School. He has a master's in environmental science, and his concentration was in ecological restoration. I'm really excited to have him here. Eli, I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation, and I'll come back at the end and help facilitate questions and answers.
Thank you, Bob. That was a great intro. Holy smokes. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Really appreciate it. It's very exciting, really big group. And shall we get going? Okay. So as Bob alluded to, at a superficial level, our forests appear to be okay when you're driving down the highway or on back roads, especially during the summertime. Our forests appear green, lush, and healthy. But that's what we call the big green illusion. because, as you can see from this pretty alarming map, the reality is quite different. As Bob mentioned, New York forests are potentially facing collapse. This is a forest regeneration map that was made as part of a 2020 Nature Conservancy modeling study. And they found a pretty bleak picture of New York forest regeneration. They found that only about 16% of the forest plots sampled had sufficient populations of seedlings and saplings to support basic regeneration. Um, and the only areas of dark green which means adequate regeneration in the state really are up in the high peaks of the Adirondacks. There are fewer deer up there, but that's changing. There hasn't been a severe winter in over a decade. Maybe this year was different, meaning less winter mortality for deer. And sensitive species like many flowers are even beginning to decline up in the Adirondacks. Another 2023 study of 39 Eastern national parks and monuments found that 27 of the 39 parks were found to be at imminent or probable failure for regeneration, with only one park, which was Acadia way up in Maine, having acceptable sapling density. And deer browse impact was consistently the strongest predictor of regeneration abundance in that study. This has huge implications for us, both short and long term. Forests that can't regenerate lose beauty, biodiversity, including pollinators and birds, climate resilience, carbon sequestration potential, and their ability to support local economies. And the research is clear. The main stressor behind this regeneration crisis is deer overabundance. But before we go further here, I want to be really clear. We love deer. They're beautiful, charismatic, and they are an essential part of a healthy ecosystem. But all is not well. So let's go back in time to see how we wound up here. There are widespread accounts by early European settlers when they showed up here finding abundant game, which was absolutely unheard of in Europe at the time. But these early settlers were not the first Europeans here. Earlier explorers brought with them diseases that wiped out indigenous populations decades before colonists arrived. We'll never know true pre-colonization deer densities, but the collapse of indigenous populations due to disease may have paved the way for the rebound of deer, which can double in population every 2 years. It's estimated that indigenous communities would put away 8,500 pounds of venison. It was the staple protein, and without indigenous subsistence hunting, deer populations probably exploded by the time English settlers showed up. So the landscape really was not so much virgin as it was widowed. That's a quote from a great book called Changes in the Land: An Ecological History of New England. And so as colonization continued to unfold, the remaining indigenous people were removed. There was widespread deforestation for agriculture and grazing, especially for sheep. There were extensive markets for wild game, which was driven by fur markets in Europe and growing cities where venison was sold. And so by the middle of the 1800s in our area, there were basically no deer left, and there was extirpation of apex predators like wolves and mountain lions as well. It was estimated that there were no deer left in Connecticut and less than a dozen or two left in the Catskills and Adirondacks. And later, as agricultural abandonment accelerated due to the sod busting of the prairies and farmers selling their rocky New York farms and moving out west, our forests began to grow back, but they grew back without deer present. So around the time that these forests were starting to recover, wealthy white sportsmen or hunters who liked to pursue big game realized that hunting was in serious jeopardy. And early game conservation leaders like Teddy Roosevelt worked to pass federal legislation to help regulate and restore game populations. This was often at the expense of indigenous people and healthy ecosystems. And there's a great book on this called Wild by Design by Laura Martin. Um, the Lacey Act was passed in 1900. It was the first federal law to protect wildlife, and it banned the sale of game species like deer. And around that time, state wildlife agencies were starting to be formed. The New York Department of Environmental Conservation, or the DEC, was originally called the New York Wildlife Commission, and one of its primary tasks was to restore game populations. And this was happening across the country at the time. Seed populations of deer were being restored to a gravely injured continent devoid of subsistence human hunters and apex predators. And as game restoration was unfolding, the North American model of wildlife conservation was developed. Today, it has 7 core tenets that are foundational to how wildlife agencies manage deer. A few of these tenets are things like game species belong to the public, they're held in public trust, they're managed by government agencies based on science, and wildlife access or hunting is allocated democratically. The efforts to restore and manage game populations is considered a huge conservation success story. But today, we potentially have deer populations that are higher than they ever were historically. You can see the dotted gray middle line there in the upper left, documenting the near crash of deer and then the rapid rebound as a result of restoration efforts. And that was in part due to the young forests that were growing at the time. But we've also created the perfect fragmented habitat for deer. We've got millions of acres of ag land and suburban yards and gardens, which help subsidize deer populations, especially in the wintertime. We no longer have the regulating factors, which help keep deer populations within ecological carrying capacity, like really long, harsh winters with deep snow into the spring. It was common even up until the 70s and 80s to have massive winter mortality. We don't have human subsistence hunters, and we don't have apex predators either. And so today we have a situation where we've surpassed ecological carrying capacity and social carrying capacity, and where the only factor limiting deer populations in most places is food availability. Meaning that today, this is the situation we have. We have forests with empty forest floors, and if they're not empty, they're dominated by a few species that deer don't eat, including many invasive plants. But the effects of decades of deer overabundance are very slow, but these effects accumulate. As I mentioned earlier, deer populations can double every 2 years. Adult deer eat somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds of vegetation per year, which I've heard translates to something like 800,000 terminal buds. That's a lot of seedlings and saplings and flowers. And as deer populations grew, the plants they like to eat the most, the flowers, shrubs, seedlings, and saplings slowly start disappearing. This all happens slowly over decades, and it's pretty hard to notice unless you've got a trained eye. But foresters and ecologists, even back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, were starting to recognize the problem. And there's a great Aldo Leopold quote: "I now suspect that just as a deer herd lives in mortal fear of its wolves, so does a mountain live in mortal fear of its deer." Um, there's another quote by a Cornell researcher: "To see the future of the forest, look down at the ground. If there are no or few seedlings or saplings, there's no future for that forest." And we think of our forests as wild places or preserves, but in many cases, all that we're preserving is the trees that grew up before the deer became a problem. So what's happening on the regional level? Because this is not just happening in New York. This is a paper that was published in 2019. On the left side, you can see seedling density. Seedlings are baby trees, under a foot tall or so. There's still some areas of green, but there should be a lot more. On the right are saplings, sapling density. Saplings are young trees between 2 and 5 feet tall, which is prime browsing height for deer. And as you can see, we've got a major problem. Most trees can grow just fine in the shade of their parents. They're just waiting for some opening of light to occur. And without constant deer browse year after year, seedlings can grow into saplings, but this is just not possible throughout much of the East today. It's also reported that deer are a greater threat to forests than climate change, and I think this illustrates why. So, what are the cascading ecological impacts of high deer numbers? This was a paper published in 2011 using data that was collected over about 10 years in the 70s and through the early 90s. Researchers in Pennsylvania fenced deer in at different densities across some areas of which had been clear cut. These were densities ranging from 0 deer per square kilometer up to about 30, which is about 80 deer per square mile. This study could not be repeated today as the deer basically starved at higher densities. And you can see as deer densities increase, tree species diversity, caterpillar density, and bird density all go down. Doug Tallamy, a pretty famous entomologist, has a statistic that it takes about 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch of chickadees. So no surprise that as caterpillar density declines, so does bird density. It's all connected. Columbia Land Conservancy, our local land conservation organization, has recently conducted some aerial surveys of deer using a drone fitted with a thermal camera. And they've counted between 67 and 100 deer per square mile, and they've counted 100 multiple times. These numbers are probably pretty common throughout most of the Hudson Valley. There's nothing particularly unique about the areas they were surveying. So if you carry those trend lines over a bit towards 100 per square mile, you can see we've got a major biodiversity problem. So what about the flowers? This is a figure from a paper titled, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? A Call for Federal Leadership in Deer Management in the US. And this was published this past winter by Dr. Bernd Blasi, a Cornell ecologist and researcher. And he studied browse rates and seed set on spring wildflowers when they're exposed to deer and when they're protected. And if you look under the picture there, you can see there's a staggering difference in seed set when these beautiful flowers are protected versus when they're not. In many places, these plants are already gone from the landscape. They're locally extinct. And if there are remnant populations, it's really hard for them to grow, expand their populations, and potentially move in response to climate change. There's just few safe landing places for seeds, not just flowers, but tree seeds as well. Native plants are remarkably resilient, though. They've dealt with huge climate shifts many times by either moving or adapting in place. But this resilience is currently undermined by high deer numbers. And if we want these beautiful flowers and other sensitive species to have a future, it's going to require very few deer on the landscape for a period of time. There's so few of these species left in many places that even low deer densities can undermine the recovery of these flowers. But the impacts of deer don't just stop at the edge of the forest. Deer have a profound effect on biodiversity in fallow fields, meadows, and even wetlands. These are all places where biodiversity should be thriving in the absence of agriculture and development and recreational brush hogging and people mowing their lawns. If you remember back to late summer, early fall, seeing old fields that were monocultures of yellow goldenrod. These are great keystone plants. Thankfully, deer don't eat a number of them. But old fallow fields should also be full of aster species, whites, blues, purples. But they're missing from these landscapes because they're deer candy. And asters are really important. They support about 100 species of caterpillars and I think 33 species of specialist bees. There's also a lot of meadow and pollinator habitat restoration work happening around the Hudson Valley today. Unfortunately, a lot of these efforts are often undermined by high deer numbers. So, what about direct human impacts and human health? I'm sure we all know folks who've had Lyme disease, or you've even had Lyme yourself. High deer populations mean high deer tick populations and increased Lyme disease risk. Ticks require a large mammal in order to complete their reproductive life cycle, and deer are the most prevalent large mammal out there. And on small islands where they've successfully reduced deer populations, they've seen rates of Lyme disease go down as well. Deer are also the most deadly animal in North America. Deer vehicle collisions kill about 440 people a year, out of, I believe, the 458 that are killed in confrontations with wildlife. In New York alone, we have about 70,000 deer vehicle collisions a year, and most of these deer are not dying peacefully on the side of the road. They're suffering. High deer populations also undermine deer herd health. Chronic wasting disease, or CWD, is a fatal prion disease. It's the deer version of mad cow, and it's now endemic in about 36 states. And we don't have CWD in New York, thankfully, but it's on our doorstep. It's in Pennsylvania. It's actually showed up in New York back in the early 2000s, and we're the only state to have eradicated it. But one of the best ways to reduce the spread of CWD is by reducing deer numbers, because it's spread by physical contact between deer. In places where it has really high prevalence rates, like in southern Wisconsin, they're starting to see impacts to deer populations. But we do not want this disease to spread, and it also has potential implications for human health as well. The agricultural impacts of deer are also huge. It's estimated that deer are responsible for about 70% of wildlife crop losses. In 2002, New York farmers estimated their deer-related crop damage at about 59 million, and about a quarter of farmers said that deer damage was a huge factor affecting their profits. More recent study out of Rutgers in 2022 surveyed 27 farmers, and they conservatively estimated the impact of deer damage at about 1.4 million, or about $50,000 per farmer. That's direct deer damage to crops, reducing yields, and hidden costs like having to build expensive fences. And margins for farmers, as we well know, are already really low. So this is a staggering impact. I personally don't think it's fair to farmers to bear the burden that's created by states managing deer to satisfy hunters and ill-informed residents. We're going to get into more of that later. Yeah, deer damage was described by the New Jersey Farm Bureau as endemic, and it was the #1 issue among farmers for a number of years at their annual meetings. So where do we go from here? We currently have an imperfect toolbox to address this crisis, and we're going to go through these tools and ones that are often considered. So the primary tool that state wildlife agencies use to manage deer today is recreational hunting, mainly through trying to get hunters to shoot female deer, which are called does. But recreational hunting is ineffective at reducing deer populations, and this has been shown quite clearly in the research. More bucks are harvested annually than does in New York, and this is common actually across the country. And deer populations are not managed by hunting bucks. You need over 60% of the does harvested per year to begin population reductions, and we're nowhere near that. About 2 does are harvested by hunters per square mile in New York, and we probably have deer densities between 50 and 100 per square mile. And just some numbers to add context to this. The DEC issues about 700,000 doe tags per year, and only about 13% of those are filled. There's a drop in the bucket. About less than 3% of New York hunters harvest more than 1 doe. We also have declining hunter numbers. Less than 4% of New York residents hunt, and license holders have declined from about 1 million in the late 50s to just over 500,000 today. And we're facing a hunter demographic cliff as well. The majority of New York hunters are baby boomers, rapidly approaching ages where folks stop hunting. And there are also other issues related to recreational hunting around land access. There are lots of landowners that simply don't allow recreational hunting on their land. And development and suburbanization also limit recreational hunting opportunity. But one of the main reasons recreational hunting is not reducing deer populations is this. We have a culture of hunting that focuses predominantly on hunting bucks or big bucks. And this is a product of the conservation effort to restore deer over 100 years ago, and it's very much with us today. Hunters think of themselves as the ones out there helping to manage deer populations, but they're not getting the job done. And state wildlife agencies have tailored their decisions for decades to meet the needs or the desires of hunters, which make up only a small percentage of the population, at the expense of the health and future of our forests and biodiversity and the desires of New York residents. Hunter advocacy organizations are also play a key role here. They're really well organized, well funded, and politically connected, and often oppose any proposed changes that might address this crisis. The DEC does provide additional ways for people who own forests and for farmers and other landowners to attempt to mitigate deer impacts. This is through issuing permits like DMAPs, which are deer management assistance permits, and DDPs, deer depredation permits. But these also have a limited effect. It's hard to find hunters willing to put in the time to fill these tags. And these tags also come, or these permits come with a lot of restrictions as well, making meaningful deer management really hard. That said, the DEC is slowly starting to acknowledge the problem. In 2021, they published a 10-year deer management plan where they're calling for 25% deer population reductions in the areas in orange here. And the rest of the state, which is white, they want to keep them the same. And that's mainly to appease hunters who are the ones answering their surveys in greatest numbers. The DEC is slowly changing regulations to attempt to increase harvest. This is through issuing more recreational tags and extending the hunting seasons a bit. But these changes are not meaningfully going to address the problem, but at least it's a step in the right direction. Oops, gotta go back. Sorry. But yeah, if you're a forest owner, farmer, pollinator lover, etc., I'd be happy to help you get started with hunting, help you identify and apply for the right kind of tags, or help you get set up with an ecologically minded hunter, but they are very few and far between. If you're interested in learning how to hunt, the first step is to take the 3 or 4 hour online New York hunter safety course. Another form of lethal management is culling. This is usually used by municipalities or institutions who manage land, and it works for a short period of time, but you end up creating a donut hole effect where the surrounding deer immediately fill right back in. There's a town in the Finger Lakes called Lansing where they decided to do a cull. They did an aerial survey of deer before the cull. They counted 100 deer per square mile. They did the cull, and they redid the survey, and they counted 100 deer per square mile not long after. So limited effect. That's also really expensive. You have to hire professional organizations to come in and do this. It can cost up to $1,000 per deer. And it's really contentious within these communities, and pushback often results in municipalities exploring non-lethal methods like fertility control. Again, you have a similar effect here where you create donut holes which fill in with new deer with minimal lasting impacts, and it can cost hundreds to thousands of dollars per deer. Darting fertility control is one of the options where they're administering birth control via dart. The effects here are temporary, though. You have to reapply a dart to a doe every 1 to 2 years. The deer cannot be eaten. And darting deer educates them very quickly. Good luck shooting that same doe again. Another method is surgical sterilization of does. In this instance, there's a pretty crazy unintended effect where sterilized does who don't have the burden of having to give birth every year live much longer lives. They can live up to 15 years, something like that. And if they're not shot by a hunter, they'll either die by being hit by a car or due to starvation when their teeth wear down to the gums and they're then taken down by coyotes or bobcats, which is a rough way to go. Um, there's also surgical sterilization of bucks where they're performing a vasectomy. They actually did this on Staten Island a few years ago, where in some areas they did a vasectomy on like up to 90% of the bucks. And what happens here is pretty crazy. So the bucks are shooting blanks, which means the rut goes on for months. The rut is the breeding season, the breeding period for deer. And so if the does aren't getting bred, they go into heat the next month and again the next month, which means that over that period of time, there's a huge spike in car accidents because the bucks are chasing the does at peak rush hour every day. So it's pretty rough. And fertility control and sterilization raise some questions around ethics. These are wild animals. Should we be treating them as we treat our pets and livestock? So we've reviewed some of the direct interventions, but can nature come to our rescue on this? So I think we should allow wolves to return. They're trying to. I'd love to see them out my window. But we'd need thousands of wolves in New York to make a dent. And it's just socially, politically, and ecologically impossible. The trophic cascade impacts of wolves are pretty limited. You may have heard about the Yellowstone wolf story, how wolves change rivers. But that story has been rewritten as a result of recent research. There's also a concept called the ecology of fear. But deer are really smart. They'll just change up their patterns a little bit, and it has a limited effect too. So if nature's not going to come to our rescue on this, it's up to us. The solution is delicious. Venison is truly carbon negative and biodiversity positive protein. We created this problem of deer overabundance through our management decisions over the last 100 or so years, and we can fix it. It's time we humans start acting like the keystone species we can be. We brought deer back from the brink before, and we now have the responsibility to bring our forests, flowers, and pollinators and birds back from the brink too. We are land stewards. Um, we need to develop the tools and societal call to action to make this happen, though. And while we develop these tools and build some awareness around this, we can build deer exclosures. So deer exclosures are easy and inexpensive to build and maintain, but they are not the solution, but they are a meaningful Band-Aid. This is a photo from the deer exclosure project that Bob mentioned earlier, where I helped build one at our town's conservation area. It was a great project. Deer exclosures, or this particular design, costs about $1,000 per acre just in materials, and about $1,500 if you have to pay for labor. And what's great about them is that you can very easily facilitate natural forest regeneration because the overstory trees are still there and that seed is continuing to fall. But in most places, the forest understory is severely depleted, due in part to historic land use like agriculture, but also decades of deer overabundance. And within these exclosures, we can do the restoration work to help bring some of these species back, and help create small biodiversity arcs until we're able to reduce deer populations in the future. Where we live a few years ago, we built a 12 or 13 acre exclosure, and it will make you want to cry when you go in there today. We've got sassafras, tupelo, maples, and oak saplings already 3 or 4 feet tall. And within our exclosure, we have a population of white turtlehead along a little forested wetland that blooms. It's the only place around where we live that we see white turtlehead blooming. It's really beautiful. And we even found a small patch of a native orchid last year. Somehow it survived, and hopefully this year we're going to see it flower after not being browsed by deer for the last few years. Deer exclosures have also been extensively researched. Within deer exclosures, many invasive plants like stiltgrass, garlic mustard, and swallowwort can go away over time or reduce in abundance. As do invasive earthworms. There are no native earthworms in the northeast. They were wiped out by the last period of glaciation. And earthworms are another major stressor in our forests, and managing deer helps in reducing their impacts. Within large exclosures over time, the forest duff layer, the leaf litter layer, can start to accumulate again. And as you can see pretty clearly in this image, native plants can compete just fine with invasive plants if they're not being browsed year after year. There's also a paper published last week, actually, that found that deer exclusion improves soil carbon storage and enhances methane uptake, which is fascinating. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me directly. We have some deer exclosure design resources to share. We have a video coming out very soon on how to build the exclosure that we think is best. And we have a one-pager on the design that also has a material list. And we're also hosting a deer exclosure building workshop on March 29th. And at the end, I have a link to that. And we'll be sharing that and follow up to this presentation as well. There have been grant opportunities out there to help fund deer exclosures. The Regenerate New York Forestry Cost Share Grant Program is a program of the DEC. And Partners for Climate Action has had an ecological restoration grant program where this past year there was a forest health track to help fund deer exclosures. Unfortunately, both of these grant opportunities are currently closed, but hopefully there will be funding available in the future for this restoration work. So we don't have a silver bullet to this problem at the current time, but there are a number of things that need to happen. So first, there are currently no legal incentives for hunters or landowners to harvest deer. It's hard to envision a way forward without incentives to try to incentivize hunters to shoot more deer. So it's currently illegal to sell wild venison. The venison that you might see at stores is from New Zealand, potentially, or farmed locally, which actually poses major health threats to wild deer through CWD risks. The DEC is actually calling for legalizing the sale of wild venison to expand their toolbox. And legalizing these incentives requires legislative changes. We also need to think about incentives for landowners. About 90% of New York land is privately owned, and there could and should be, tax incentives and other structures in place for landowners who allow hunting and fill certain tags. The DEC is calling for an expanded toolbox here, but their hands are tied. And that's where coalition building and advocacy needs to come in. There's yet to be a concerted effort in New York to push for regulatory and legislative changes to better manage deer. We need folks and organizations who care about forests, climate, carbon, pollinators, Lyme disease, etc., to start working together to start pushing for change here. And we're starting to organize this work. A study came out this past February that assessed New York resident attitudes towards lethal management and found that 70% of survey participants support control of deer if it means healthy forests, reduce Lyme disease, and reduce deer vehicle collisions. So the public support is there. But as I mentioned, special interest groups that are highly vocal, specifically hunting advocacy groups and animal welfare groups, have historically dominated management decisions, and that's got to change. We also need a culture shift among hunters and landowners, and this is going to require a huge public education and awareness building effort. We're starting to work with a communications firm to explore ways that we can raise awareness. So stay tuned for that. Um, we also need accountability at the DEC. Their mandate is to manage deer for the desires of all New York residents. We know that New York residents want healthy, resilient forests with lower Lyme disease risk and fewer deer vehicle collisions. And we need to start pushing the DEC out of business as usual deer management, which has historically set objectives to accommodate hunters and the advocacy organizations. And we know there are many allies within DEC, but they really need our support. And lastly, we need local monitoring. So we have ways of modeling large-scale forest regeneration across New York, like the models behind the Nature Conservancy map I showed at the beginning. But we have no local monitoring at scale. The DEC started working towards this about 10 years ago, and they helped develop a protocol called AVID, Assessing Vegetation for Deer Impacts, something like that. Turns out it's not an ecologically valid monitoring protocol. And their goal was to have over 3,000 of these plots across the state. And 10 years later, we've only got about 30. We need the DEC to implement local forest health monitoring at scale. We need hundreds or thousands of sites across New York so that we can know what's happening on a local level and design deer management as needed. And so that's what I got. Any questions?
Wow, that's great, Eli. Yes, there are many questions. I've been monitoring the chat, and thank you everybody for putting your questions in there. I noticed we have about 10 minutes, so that's we're going to take full advantage of that 10 minutes. I'll start with a set of questions that has gotten a lot of thumbs up. And it has to do with the kind of multi-state efforts to address this issue. Are there any? Is there anything that you're aware of? And also related to this, someone referenced the Pennsylvania Game Commission's effort at deer control in Pennsylvania to 2000 through 2004. A fellow named Gary Alt was involved with this. So if you can speak to, first and foremost, just any efforts that you might be aware of where the states surrounding New York are working cooperatively.
There are no real cooperative efforts towards addressing this problem that I'm aware of. There have been some examples of states attempting legislative changes. Maryland, New Jersey, and more recently, I believe it was Iowa. That might be incorrect, but there have been bills proposed to create incentives for hunters and to incentivize venison donation as well. But they're immediately shot down and go nowhere, unfortunately, because in part, hunter advocacy organizations, these national organizations, are so well connected and well organized that they immediately quell or squash those bills. But as I mentioned, there hasn't been a concerted effort to bring the stakeholders together to push for change, folks that care about forests, et cetera. And so that's one of the things that really needs to happen. And I believe it needs to happen on a state-by-state basis. And so, yeah, we're hoping to take a leadership role in that in New York.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we got another question, a person asking for clarity. The issue is not that hunting is ineffective, but rather that the current paradigm of hunting bucks is not effective. Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so if hunters were out there filling all of their doe tags, we would be in a different position here. Most hunters can get between 2 to 5 doe tags, something like that, and in some cases even more, and most are not filling them. Hunters absolutely have a role to play here, and um, yeah, they need to step up.
Mhm. And what can our state representatives do to influence the DEC and perhaps other agencies to help restore the understory? And how can we as audience members play a part in that?
So we have to be vocal with our representatives about this. As I mentioned, the DEC has very limited ability to lobby and very little time in front of legislators. And they have this 10-year deer management plan where they're calling for some legislative changes to expand their toolbox. But without us pounding the table on this, nothing's going to change. So that's where us being vocal and us helping to educate our neighbors and helping to educate our legislators is really important. But there are meaningful things that we can do. We can do the really important restoration work that needs to be done. We can help build deer exclosures. Folks who are willing to get their hands a little dirty can learn how to hunt um, and help manage deer on the land that they want to better manage and steward. There are a lot of actions that we can currently take.
Great. Thought we had an interesting question. Someone was asking if any local chefs are involved, restaurants and chefs, in addressing the issue. Um,
So, yeah, good question. As it's currently illegal to sell wild venison, I don't believe there are any restaurants that serve wild venison, although some certainly do serve farmed venison, but that is a very different thing. But yeah, it would be great to educate chefs on this as well. The venison would have to be donated to the restaurant, and I don't believe the restaurant or chef could charge for the plate. But their venison is really delicious, and as I said, it's carbon negative and biodiversity positive protein, and we should be eating more of it. And it would be absolutely awesome to go to a local restaurant and see local wild venison on the menu. And hopefully one day we'll get there. Um, uh, Selling wild venison is legal throughout most of Europe, and it's on menus. And this is an issue in Europe as well. And they're trying to meaningfully address this issue through trying to increase the rate of venison consumption among the public there.
mhm. Can you say a little something about the farmed venison that, yeah, I think some of us, I used to think I was helping the problem if I ordered venison off a restaurant menu. Um, where's that coming from and compared to wild venison?
Yeah, so it's either coming from overseas where it's farmed, or it's coming from, local farms or farms across the US where they're basically farming wild deer in these high fence operations. And the human health concern there is um, chronic wasting disease within these high fence operations. This past fall, actually, on a deer farm, I believe west of Albany, chronic wasting disease was actually found. I don't think it was on a whitetail farm; it was on another species of deer farm. But yeah, a lot of these farms bring in genetics from other places that may have chronic wasting disease, and yeah, it's a threat. Did that
Great.
answer the question?
Yes, thank you. Um, I'm going to ask one more question, then I have a couple of announcements. Just the last question. Are the main forest organizations united or at least aligned on forest management policy?
Um, I don't know if they're aligned on forest management policy because it doesn't seem like there are many policies out there around forest health, but they're certainly aligned or aware and agree on the problem. Yeah, this is a very well researched issue, and there is scientific consensus that forest health is severely impacted by high deer populations.
Mhm. Great, great. Well, Eli, this has been really, really informative. I'm sure I speak for everybody when I just thank you sincerely for all the time you put into this. And uh, all of us at PCA are just so grateful that you are chairing our forest task force. And there's going to be a lot more information coming from the Forest Health Task Force at PCA. Eli had mentioned a few of the initiatives that are underway right now. So everybody, please continue to look at our website, continue to watch your emails. If you're not yet registered for email, go on our website and get yourself registered, because I think there's going to be a lot more to share, and it's exciting. So thank you again, Eli. This is terrific. I want to remind everybody we have recorded this, and we will be posting this on YouTube with a link from our website, so you can refer to it, and yeah, kind of reach out that way. A few reminders. We hold these morning coffee webinars most months. And next month, on April 8th, we will be featuring Renee Lertzman, an amazing psychologist, who will be talking about building community consensus, which I think we can see from this talk today. We need community consensus around these issues. So look forward to that. Also, remember the deer exclosure walk that Eli mentioned. It's on Sunday, March 28th. We'll put a link to that to register. There is a small fee for that, but it's on Sunday the 28th from 10 in the morning to 12:30, and it's a great opportunity. I was really blown away when I went to see my first deer exclosure, to see just the stark difference between the rest of the forest and then this beautiful green lush area that's been able to grow up protected by the exclosure. And I just encourage everybody to sign up for that and get a look at it. That or other workshops, I'm going to say, but we're limiting the number of people because that's practical, but we'll be doing more of these as well. Also, reminding folks, we have a request for proposals out for youth action grants. If you know of a young person ages 15 to 24 who wants to take climate action, we're offering grants up to $5,000 to individual kids, high school or college environmental clubs, anybody with an idea who wants to do something. Get them to submit a simple request to us by March 28th. We also have a new program called Funding Futures, which is a really, I think, amazing opportunity to help communities identify and then fund their environmental priorities. So we have a request for proposals out that closes on May 23rd, but check that out. More information on our website. Again, we're going to be sending out to all of you today a link to the recording and also documentation, anything that has been referenced today in terms of resource materials. We'll send those to you as well. We encourage you to stay involved and connected. It's going to take all of us to address this huge issue. So with that, I'm going to thank Eli again. I'm going to thank all of you for coming and wish you a good day. Bye-bye.